Hey guys, welcome back to my kitchen. Today I'm going to teach you a recipe that I've kind of made up. It's something that I've been working on for probably about a month now to make sure that it's perfect. I'm going to teach you how to make a nice loaf of sourdough bread. Not one of the rustic ones, but like a sandwich loaf. So if you picture when you go into a deli and they give you a sandwich that's on a nice, like you can tell it was sliced off of a loaf of sandwich bread, but it's nice and hearty and it's got a good chew to it. That's what I'm going to teach you how to make today. So let's get to it. So the first thing that I'm going to do to make this bread is I'm going to activate my yeast. So all I have to do for that is I'm going to take 1 3/4 of nice warm water. Now this is just like I turn on the tap water on hot, let it run for a little while until it starts feeling like a nice temperature on my hands. And that's the temperature we have here. Then I'm going to take 3/4 teaspoon of active dry yeast, and I'm going to sprinkle that evenly over the top of the water. You'll see that they float for the most part. They'll start to sink after a little while, but they also clump. If you just kind of dump them in, they will clump together. So you want to really try and sprinkle it evenly so that they can all be activated by the warm water. So there's our 3/4 teaspoon of active dry yeast. And then I'm going to take 2 tablespoons of sugar and I'm going to evenly sprinkle that around here as well. The sugar acts as the yeast's food, so it's really going to jumpstart it and get it working really hard, really fast. And that kind of made the yeast settle to the bottom. And that's okay, because when I start to see the yeast floating back up to the top of the water, I know that it's starting to work and that it's activated. So I'm gonna let this sit for about 5 minutes, and when I come back, there should be a nice foam on the top. And that's how I know that my yeast is alive and my yeast is working. So my mixture of yeast, sugar, and water has been sitting for about 5 minutes now. You can see that some of the yeast has risen back up to the top, but it's also got a little foam over the top. So that's how I know that this yeast is eating and it's awake and it's ready to roll. So my next step is going to be adding 5 cups of flour. And that's just regular all-purpose flour. You could probably use bread flour to get a crustier and chewier bread, but I've found that the all-purpose works perfectly for me. It's what I have on hand, so I stick with it. I'm also going to add about 1 cup of sourdough starter. So I'm gonna put a link in the description box that explains to you how to make a sourdough starter. It does take a little bit of work, but basically what it is I've fermented my own yeast. So this is what gives it the sourdough flavor. Now I've found that my sourdough starter, I'm a little too lazy with keeping up with it, so it doesn't quite give the lift to the bread that I want it to. It doesn't quite make it fluffy enough. It tends to be really dense. So that's why I've also added regular yeast in there. But I'm gonna add about 1 cup of my sourdough starter so that I can still get that sourdough flavor, even though this isn't going to be the majority of what causes my dough to rise. Perfect timing, my mixer's here. So there we go, we've added sourdough starter, we've got our flour, we have our yeast mixture, and now I'm adding a tablespoon of salt. And now Tommy's gonna come mix, because I have this new fancy toy that I love very, very much that he got me for Christmas, and I finally started using, and it makes mixing dough really easy, so I just want to show him how easy it is, so I'm gonna let him do it. So he's just gonna mix it all together until it's a nice shaggy dough. Thank you, Tommy, for mixing for me. So now all I'm gonna do with this is I'm going to poke off as much of the dough from my fancy little whisk as I can. And I'm going to let this rise until it's just about double in size. I'd say that'll take probably like, oh my goodness, choking on flour. It'll probably take about 2, maybe 3 hours. So I'm gonna wash my hands really quickly and then I'll be right back. All right, hands are clean, I'm back. So I'm gonna cover this with saran wrap and I'm going to let it rise in a warm oven for 2 or 3 hours until it's doubled in size. So it'll come probably right up to the top of this. If you don't have a proof setting on your oven, all you have to do is turn it on like 350 for probably 2 to 5 minutes, depending on how efficient your oven is at heating up. And then turn it off and then put this in there. It should be a pretty good temperature for rising. You want it to be between like probably 80 and 90 degrees in there. So now for my big fancy trick. I already have a batch of dough. This has been rising for 3 hours. It's got a ton of lift on it. It's risen big time. So I'm going to take my plastic wrap off. Probably not worth trying to scrape it off. It's really sticky. And then I'm gonna sprinkle on a whole bunch of flour all over the top. And then there's my little tool. I'm gonna use this to just kind of scrape it up from the sides. It's gonna release a lot of those bubbles, which is fine, because the bubbles are currently helping us form gluten. So we wanna pop them down and let them rise again. But before I let them rise again, I'm gonna give this a little knead. So I'm gonna cover this in some flour. I'm gonna knead it for probably 5 minutes in the bowl, and then I'm going to let it rise again until it comes back up to doubled in size. So when it starts getting really sticky, you can just sprinkle on a little bit more flour. All you're really looking for is for this to be nice and smooth and elasticy. All right, so I've kneaded this for 5 minutes. So now when I poke it, you can see that it bounces back. That means that we've formed a good amount of gluten. It took me 5 minutes, probably wouldn't have even taken me that long if it wasn't so sticky. Whenever it got sticky, I just added a little extra flour. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna let this rise again until it comes back up to the top of the bowl. It'll happen quicker this time. It'll probably only take an hour. All right, so my dough has risen all the way back up to the top, which means that we are done with that rise. And we're good to take it out of the bowl. So I'm gonna try and get as much off of the saran wrap as I can. Awesome. And then now I'm gonna dump it out on this floured surface. Make sure that your surface is really well floured because this dough is really sticky. I'm just gonna scrape all the dough off the bottom of the bowl so that we can get all the bread possible. It also makes cleanup easier. Fantastic. To the side, and now I'm going to sprinkle some of this flour. I usually just kind of put my hands in the flour and then pat it on the top to make the top of the dough less sticky. And while I do this, I'm going to kind of press out some of the air pockets that are in there. Because remember what I said before, that as the yeast rises, the carbon dioxide will stretch the dough, which is just as important as kneading because it helps to form gluten, and gluten is what we want to make it nice and chewy. So there we go. Now I'm just going to kind of pat it out, and I want to keep this area about the same size because I want it to be able to fit in here. So this should be about the same as that, if that makes any sense at all. So I'm gonna pat it down, and then once it's all patted down, I'm gonna kind of dust it off because we don't want a ton of hunks of flour in there. And I'm going to really tightly roll it. The more tension you get, the better crust you're gonna get, and the better it's gonna split when you score it. When you slice the top of it, you're gonna get a better split at the top, the tighter that you roll it. Now I did oil that bread pan a lot, and I oiled right up and over the sides because this will go up and over the sides. So now I've got a nice tight loaf there that I'm going to just place into my loaf pan. And what I like to do is I like to take a spray bottle and I spray the top of my loaf a little bit. It helps to keep the dough moist. It'll also help to give it a crispy crust when it's in the oven. And I'm going to let it rise until it comes just to the top of this, until it just kind of domes. It's not going to dome that much, that was an exaggeration. It's going to dome kind of like that at the top of this bread pan. And that's how I know that it's ready to bake. So I'll come back when we get there. Alright, so my bread in the pan has risen until it's just coming over the pan. So that's exactly what I'm looking for. My oven is preheated to 410 degrees. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut a slit in this. Immediately after I cut the slit, I'm going to put it in the oven, and then I'm going to throw in as many ice cubes as I can get in there without them melting super quickly. Having steam in the oven is going to give you a really good crust. You guys aren't going to be able to see that, but that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'll probably get in 5 to 8 ice cubes. Thank you, Tommy. In the bottom of the oven. And most ovens on the bottom have like a little divot in the center that's meant for steam cleaning your oven, but that's where I put my ice cubes. So I'm going to cut a slit in this, and then I'm going to get moving to get this into the oven because it is pretty time sensitive. You have to do it quickly.
So I don't remember if I said it, but that's going to bake for 30 minutes.
And that's how I make my, I guess, deli style sourdough bread. It's nice and moist, nice and spongy. It's got a really nice crust. You can hear that. It's super tasty, especially right now while it's warm with a little bit of butter. It's my favorite part. Immediately when it comes out of the oven, Tommy and I come in and we slice off the end piece and we spread it with some butter, and it's just the best. So let me know if you guys try it at home. It would be super cool if you guys made your own starter. It's really fun and it's a really cool experiment to do at home. So let me know if you give it a shot. I hope you have a good one.